With young men of such integrity and conviction, the future of our country is indeed bright, as long as we keep raising young men of such caliber. It occurred to me as I was looking over this congregation that for many of you, this may be the very first time in one of our buildings. To you especially, I say welcome. We hope that you feel comfortable here. We hope that you feel that you are with some of your best friends and neighbors, and that we love you and that we care about you, and that we want you to enjoy your experience today and any time in the future that you'd like to come and be with us. Thank you again for coming. Now, brothers and sisters, as interesting as it sounds, I'm not going to talk to you in the few minutes that I have about religious liberty. My purpose is to set the table. It is to whet your appetite for the feast of knowledge and the special feelings that I pray will come into your hearts as men and women who know these topics better than I address them on all of our behalfs. I hope that they teach, I hope that they instruct, I hope that they edify every single one of us, with the net result that we become more convinced in our hearts that we must act in the protection, in the defense, and in the preservation of these sacred liberties of which we will speak today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make 4 statements. I believe each of them to be a fundamental truth. Now, 3 of them I believe will be so implicitly obvious that none of you will need to even question whether or not it's true. The 4th we'll talk about in just a moment. Statement number 1. The invited guests at this podium today and in this congregation today represent the most culturally, politically, and doctrinally diverse group of human beings ever assembled in this building. Truth number 2. Every one of us, every man, every woman, every child is a child of God. He loves every single one of us, irrespective of our cultural heritage, of our political inclination, or of our doctrinal platform. As such, we are truly brothers and sisters. Statement and truth number 3. The world in which we live has become increasingly polarized over the past 50 years. In some circles, it is now blood sport to magnify differences, to celebrate contention, and to purposefully fuel the fires of discord between diverse groups of individuals. Statement number 4. And while not wishing to dismiss very important doctrinal differences that do exist, or to state that they are not important, I submit, brothers and sisters, that there are issues so critically important to the well-being of God's children, so critically important to the well-being of every single one of us, that we can and indeed we must unite our diverse viewpoints so that we all enjoy a greater good. History has shown that when people do that, God hears and answers those petitions and those prayers. And miracles can happen. Now, the first 3, I'm sure, were intuitively obvious. I don't think there is any need for discussion on any one of those points. The 4th one, some of you may be saying, well, I don't know if that's true. So let me offer this vignette from American history to prime the pump for this meeting. I start in the neonatal intensive care unit days of our nation's birth, before we were a nation, when we were 13 individual nation states, 13 different colonies, 13 different state governments, 13 different currencies, 13 different tariffs, 13 different foreign policies, 13 different objectives, many of whom had fled for what we plead for today. These men knew that individually they were weak and they were vulnerable, but together that something special, very special, could happen. And so this very diverse group of individuals came together in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on May 25th of 1787. And for 5 weeks they argued and they contended and they fought and they staked out their various selfish interests, and they accomplished absolutely nothing. Not one thing. By mid and late July, the Constitutional Convention of this country was just about to break up. Were it not for the fortitude and conviction and will of General George Washington, the man that they had invited to be the president of the Constitutional Convention, the whole thing might have fallen apart. But he brought them back together one final time. And then something special happened. An elderly statesman, frail, sick, tired, stood before the convention for the first time. Benjamin Franklin, one of the original signers of the Declaration of Independence of the United States, stood before that convention, and I'm going to read for you words that he spoke. Mr. President, the small progress we have made after 4 or 5 weeks is a melancholy proof of the imperfection of the human understanding. We have gone back to ancient history for models of government and examined different forms of republics. We have viewed modern states all around Europe, but find none of their constitutions suitable to our circumstance. In this situation of this assembly, we are groping, as it were, in the dark to find political truth. How has it happened, sir, that we have not once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understandings? In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for the divine guidance. Our prayers, sir, were heard and they were graciously answered. Have we now forgotten so powerful a friend? Or do we imagine we no longer need his help? I have lived, sir, a long time. And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his concurring political aid, without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no greater than the builders of Babel. I therefore beg to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business. And with that, brothers and sisters, the Constitutional Convention recessed for 3 days of fasting and prayer. Having supplicated and humbled themselves before Almighty God, these same men came back, and in the same 5 weeks that they accomplished nothing, they wrote the Constitution of the United States of America, what has been deemed the greatest document ever to come from the hand and pen of the human mind. The greatest document, brothers and sisters, because it was inspired of God. So does God answer prayers and do miracles happen? I testify that they do and that they will. And this is just the sort of miracle that we hope for today. And that is why we are here. It is my prayer that we will be moved with what we learn to act, to protect and defend the religious liberties that God has given us, not government that God has bestowed upon us. Now, not wishing to offend anyone, but in keeping with the very purpose of this meeting, I close my remarks now in the name of the only begotten Son of our eternal Heavenly Father, He who I declare our Savior and Redeemer, even Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, with that background, and now the table set, and appetites thirsting and hungering, I hope, let's begin with our program. It is an immense pleasure to present Bishop Anthony Taylor as our first speaker. And actually, brothers and sisters, I'll introduce the first two speakers and then the musical number, and then we'll go to the next segment. Anthony Basil Taylor was ordained and installed as the 7th bishop for the Diocese of Little Rock on June 5th, 2008. In his capacity as bishop, Bishop Taylor presides over 130 churches, serving over 130,000 Catholics in the state of Arkansas. Bishop Taylor's Episcopal motto is taken from Psalms 37:11 and was quoted by Jesus in Matthew 5:5. Quote, "The humble shall inherit the earth." And may I just say, from the personal experience I've had with Bishop Taylor, that defines him. He is a wonderful and humble servant of God. We'll be pleased to hear from him first. After Bishop Taylor, we'll be pleased to hear from Dr. Omar Atiq. Dr. Atiq is the founding chairman of the American Muslim Peace Initiative, which is a network of leaders, of organizations uniting their voices to articulate the challenges and opportunities for promoting peace in our neighborhoods, our nation, and our world. Dr. Atiq holds the rank of Professor of Medicine at the UAMS College of Medicine and serves as Associate Director of the Winthrop P. Rockefeller Cancer Institute. Dr. Atiq received his training in medical oncology and hematology at the world-renowned Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York. Dr. Atiq serves as Governor-elect of the Arkansas chapter of the American College of Physicians and is past president of the Arkansas Medical Society. After Dr. Atiq, we have a slight change in our musical number. We will be pleased to hear from vocalist Corey Moline, who will be accompanied by Sister Rebecca Wing, and we'll go to that point on the program. Bishop Taylor.
Thank you so much, President Beheshti. In the short time allotted to me, I'd like to give a brief overview of the teaching of the Catholic Church regarding religious liberty. As a follower of Jesus Christ, I recall that he declared that we would be persecuted and we would be blessed if we suffered persecution because of his name. Jesus gave us no guarantee that our rights would be respected. During the first 300 years of our existence, martyrdom was an essential part of Christian spirituality. We Catholics recall with pride that Peter, the first pope, and Paul, the great evangelizer, both gave their lives for the faith, as did thousands of others. Religious liberty was not on the radar then, or indeed for most of our history. Over the centuries, we have persecuted others for their faith, and we have been persecuted by others for ours. And while Catholic theology on this topic has developed over time, it is striking that our most comprehensive official teaching on religious liberty only goes back 50 years to the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, which in Latin means the dignity of the human person. American Catholics recall with pride that this document of the Universal Church was drafted largely by an American priest, John Courtney Murray, who pushed for an American understanding of religious freedom drawn from the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. Dignitatis Humanae seeks to address the challenge of spreading the Christian faith while respecting democratic societies and growing religious pluralism. It asserts three fundamental rights: freedom of conscience, freedom to live one's faith individually and in community without interference, and the autonomy of religious institutions. All three of these are threatened in the world today. Freedom of conscience means that no one may force us to do what conscience forbids or forbid us to do what conscience requires, which is not the same thing as what conscience allows, and that within due limits. Examples of limits for the common good to things which some consciences might allow include having a minimum age for marriage and prohibiting the marriage of siblings and first cousins and prohibiting the marriage of persons of the same gender. Conscience does not require underage, incestuous, or same-sex unions, all of which are contrary to natural law. The right and obligation to follow the requirements of our conscience is rooted in our inalienable, God-given dignity as a human person. This does not mean, however, that we can always do whatever we want. Objective truth determines what is right or wrong, and decisions based on what is objectively false bring with them natural consequences that are destructive of the human person and of society. And in this, we have an obligation to speak out to protect the common good. For example, the Catholic Church opposes same-sex marriage not because it hates those who experience same-sex attraction, and not because we seek to perpetuate sinful discrimination against them. Quite the contrary. We oppose it because natural law, God's will for human behavior revealed in the very way He created our world, in this case the physical and sexual complementarity of the human person necessary for procreation, dictates our position that marriage is a holy endeavor between one man and one woman. Now our government and society are abandoning this objective truth regarding marriage, which had been held as self-evident by virtually all cultures from the very dawn of human existence. And despite our First Amendment rights, some who refuse to accept this truth attempt to discredit and silence us by stigmatizing unjustly Catholics and others who will not bend to the direction of today's winds and characterize us as instead motivated by hatred and intolerance. The Church's opposition to the contraceptive mandate of the Department of Health and Human Services is another application of this principle. That mandate intends to require us to participate in the provision of insurance for morally objectionable medical services, artificial contraception, non-medically indicated sterilizations, and abortions in some circumstances. Whether by providing this coverage directly or by an action that would serve to trigger that provision by a third party, forcing us to participate in what conscience forbids. Second, the freedom to live one's faith individually and in community without interference. The function of government is to provide for the common good, but when it presumes to direct or inhibit religious acts, it exceeds the limits of its authority. Our religious bodies have the right to govern themselves according to their own norms, to instruct members in their faith, to give corporate witness to their faith without hindrance, and to welcome new converts. Note that freedom of worship is only one element of religious freedom. Individuals and religious bodies have a God-given right to live our faith without hindrance in every area of life, including the manner in which we conduct our business, the schools which our children attend and the way we operate our schools, and in the way that health care services are provided. Here, the historical record of the Catholic Church in some Catholic countries is not good, especially during the medieval period. In those days, theologians held that charity required us to do all in our power to eradicate error, even enlisting government coercion in order to save society from the infection of error and for the eternal welfare of those who are headed for perdition due to idolatry or heresy or schism. But sadly, history teaches us that we can justify just about anything when we put ourselves in God's place. Deus vult, God wills it, was the rallying cry of the First Crusade. This mentality also gave us the Inquisition. And worse, this mentality also left an opening for the ongoing demonization of those who are different, leading to every form of marginalization and discrimination, and ultimately in Europe to the Holocaust. We Catholics have learned what is at stake when religious liberty is not protected. We know because not only have we been guilty historically of denying religious liberty to others, we have also been on the losing side of this dynamic in Protestant countries and continue to lack full religious freedom in many non-Christian countries today. Indeed, in some parts of Asia and Middle East, Catholics still lack even the legal freedom to worship in public. The same is true for members of many other religious minorities. In much of Latin America during the 20th century, the church was the target of governmental persecution. Guatemala produced thousands of martyrs in the 1980s, including Father Stanley Rother, an Oklahoma priest who I know or knew, whose cause for canonization is now in Rome. Now the church in Latin America is being attacked by drug cartels. 3 priests have been killed recently in southern Mexico. So governments are not the only threat to religious liberty. Here in the United States, the church is not yet a target of overt persecution, but the secular climate is becoming more hostile. And here the threat comes not from rival religious groups as in the past, but rather from an aggressive secularism that seeks to discredit and undermine faith of any sort. Third, the autonomy of religious institutions. Religious freedom is exercised in a pluralistic world, and so is subject to certain regulatory norms designed to assist in the exercise of our rights and to protect the rights of others. Therefore, the autonomy of religious institutions is not absolute. For instance, when there is proof of some violation of the rights of others, or a public peace, or a public morality, as in the case of our scandalous clergy sexual abuse crisis. Apart from this necessary restriction of religious liberty, in order to meet the requirements of justice and to safeguard the rights and freedoms of others, in all other matters, people should be free to act on their own judgment, so long as they don't use that freedom as a pretext for refusing to submit to legitimate authority in matters relating to the common good. Dignitatis Humanae insists, religious freedom ought, therefore, to have this further purpose and aim, namely that men may come to act with greater responsibility in fulfilling their duties in community life. My basic message, therefore, and that of the Catholic Church on the topic of religious liberty is inescapable. No one may licitly force us to do what conscience forbids or forbid us to do what conscience requires. We should be free to live our faith in every area of life without undue interference, not just while at worship. And religious institutions should enjoy full autonomy, limited only as needed to protect the rights of others. But you know, one major thing is missing from this presentation, namely Jesus' even more fundamental invitation to love one another as I have loved you, meaning completely, selflessly, to the point of laying down our lives for others. And that is where human freedom resides most fully. And so while we recall with pride that religious liberty is our first and greatest freedom as Americans, it's also important to remember that Jesus warned us not to expect the world to change just in order to accommodate us. Indeed, he warns us that the world will hate us when we speak a truth that people don't want to hear. And should this result in persecution, we should feel blessed and not be surprised. It has happened before. And as we see from current events, it may happen again.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of God, the most beneficent, the most merciful. President Bahishti, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I bring greetings to you from the Islamic Center of Little Rock and the Muslims of Central Arkansas that it represents. I pray for the mercy and blessings of the Almighty for all of us gathered here today. Peace be upon you, or as we say, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I'm delighted to be here in this beautiful church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's a beautiful morning. The sun is shining. I can feel the warmth, the light, and the energy. I hope you do too. When the Islamic Center was approached to join in this multi-faith community devotional to learn, understand, ponder, pray, and defend our religious freedom, I couldn't help but visualize a conversation with my late mother, telling her about it and hearing her respond that the sage who helped conceive and organize such a bonding event between God's creation is a Behishti. Now, she did not know Dr. Michael Behishti, but in her mother tongue, as in Persian, Behishti denotes one whose eternal abode is heaven. So congratulations, Michael, for being a Behishti, and thank you for arranging this wonderful experience. We're all gathered here today because religious freedom is important to us. We want to be able to pray, dress, eat, drink, work in accordance with our faith traditions. We wish to celebrate our births and marriages, and we wish to honor our dead in the ways we deem proper. We wish to live our life as we believe our Creator ordained for us, and we argue that it is our right to do so. It wouldn't be an issue if the human race were monolithic in its beliefs and monochromatic in its worldview, but that is not the case, and so this discussion, and so this gathering. A discussion that has been a part of human life for ages, and as Bishop Taylor mentioned, it's always intense, mostly emotional, rarely rational, and embarrassingly drenched in blood from all sides. So what has changed? What has brought all of us together here today with diverse religious views? Maybe we have finally learned the lesson of history. Maybe we have matured to accept the will of the Creator, accepting that there may be a different path or different paths to the same goal, that tolerance trumps prejudice, that respect bests insult, and that acceptance transcends rejection of fellow human beings. In this assembly today, when we ponder and pray for our religious freedom, which is our right, I hope we are praying for the same autonomy for the entire humanity. When we ask of others to learn and understand and respect our sacred obligations, I wish we pledge the same deference to theirs as well. Standing here in front of you, I have no hesitation in telling you that I cannot defend my religious freedom until I defend yours. For us as Muslims, it is that simple. Here in this great country, we are lucky to have the ability to shape our lives in accordance with our deeply held beliefs. Even though we have fallen short, but as Americans, we constantly try to form that perfect union to realize the vision of our founding fathers. As Dr. Behishti mentioned, the founding fathers were unequivocal about religious freedom. James Madison perceived the nation in 1785, and I quote him, he said, "An asylum to the persecuted and oppressed of every nation and religion." Among Madison's 15 points was his declaration that the religion then of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, to exercise it as these may dictate. This right in its nature is an inalienable right. In 1786, the Virginia Act of establishing religious freedom, modified somewhat from the Jefferson's original draft, became the law. The act is one of the 3 accomplishments Jefferson put on his tombstone, along with writing the Declaration and founding the University of Virginia. By the way, he omitted being the President of the United States. After the bill was passed, Jefferson proudly wrote that the law meant to comprehend within the mantle of its protection, the Jew, the Gentile, the Christian, and the Mohammedan, he didn't know who Muslims were, but knew there were some, the Mohammedan, the Hindu, and the infidel of every denomination. As President George Washington wrote in 1790, all possess alike liberty of conscience and immunity of citizenship. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens. He was addressing the members of America's oldest synagogue, the Torah synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. He further wrote, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the will of other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." So that's where our founding fathers stood on the issue of religious freedom for all of us. And so now the question, where does Islam stand on all this? What are the Islamic principles that govern Muslim behavior on this issue? How does Islam look at people following different paths, and what is its position on their right to their path? For that, I would go straight to our holy book, the Quran, and quote some passages from it. As Muslims, we believe Quran is the word of God, the Almighty Allah. It gives us our way of life. While the interpretations may vary, all Muslims who ascribe to Islam as their faith firmly believe in Quran as the ultimate guidance. And so I start with chapter 49, verse 13, where God says, "O humankind, behold, we have created you all out of a male and a female, and have made you into nations and tribes, so that you might come to know one another, not to despise one another. And verily the noblest of you in the sight of God is one who is most deeply conscious of him. Behold, God is all-knowing, all-aware." Please note that the Almighty is addressing the entire human race, not just the Muslims, and emphasizes that nobility comes from being mindful of the Lord and submitting to his will. In chapter 2, verse 136, God says, "Say, we believe in God and in that which has been bestowed from on high upon us, and that which has been bestowed upon Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac and Jacob and their descendants, and that which has been vouchsafed to Moses and Jesus, and that which has been vouchsafed to all other prophets by their sustainer. We make no distinction between any of them. And it is unto him that we surrender ourselves." This universal message of submission across times is repeated in chapter 3, verse 84. In chapter 2, verse 62, God says, "Verily, those who have attained to faith in this divine right, as well as those who follow the Jewish faith and the Christians and the Sabians, all who believe in God and the last day, all who believe in God and the last day and do righteous deeds shall have their reward with their Lord and Sustainer. And no fear need they have, and neither shall they grieve." This message of inclusiveness is repeated in chapter 5, verse 69, and now coming to the divine decree of freedom of faith as espoused by the Almighty in Quran, chapter 2, verse 256. "La ikraha fi din kad tabayyana rushd." There is no compulsion in religion, no coercion in matters of faith. And the reverse is true. So it's a statement which is comprehensive for all of us who follow Islam. In chapter 11, verse 118, and had thy sustainer so willed, he could surely have made all mankind into one single community, but he willed it otherwise. So they continue to hold divergent views. This is from Quran. This is a translation. And it says in chapter 5, verse 48, "And if God had so willed, he could surely have made you all one single community, but he willed it otherwise in order to test you, by means of what he has vouchsafed with you, unto you. And then he says in the same verse why he made us different. Why then with one another in doing good? Why then with one another in doing good? Unto God you all must return, and he then will make you understand truly that which you are wont to differ. So this is, my friends, in essence, the Islamic message. I've just shared some translation of verses with you that should help us understand, I hope, the inclusiveness of the Quranic message, the reverence of varied paths that the Almighty created over times, the respect, mercy, and love that God cloaks his entire creation with, and finally the divine proclamation about freedom of religion, the very topic of today's discussion. Thank you, and may God be with you. Thank you very much.
Bless this land, dear God, our Father. Bless this land, thy children pray. Uphold us in our just endeavors. Speed our efforts, light our way. Bless this land, dear God, our Father. Heal our wounds and right our wrongs. Defend us with thy arm forever. Teach us faith and make us strong. Bless every land and a nation under heaven. At thy command, let all our conflicts cease. Oh, teach us love for all of thy creation. Teach us wisdom. Teach us mercy. Teach us peace. Bless this land, dear God, our Father. Bless this home, the one we love. Oh, may our hope shine ever brighter, guide and guard us from above. Make us thine, dear God, our Father, for each kingdom is thine own. Unite our hearts until we gather as one people at thy throne. Bless every land and a nation under heaven. At thy command, let all our conflicts cease. Oh, teach us love for all of thy creation. Teach us wisdom. Teach us mercy. teach us peace. Dear God our Father, teach us peace.
Thank you so much, Brother Moline and Sister Wing. Well, I don't know about you, but this has been wonderful. Bishop Taylor, thank you very, very much for that beautiful message. And Dr. Atik, and to the Islamic Center of Little Rock, thank you very much for coming and being part of this. I hope that bonds of friendship and feelings of greater understanding are beginning to distill within us, literally as we sit. And I'll follow up on that a little bit later. We will be pleased to hear in order the next two speakers. Our first message comes from Bishop Gary Moeller. Unfortunately, Bishop Moeller is not with us today. A travel requirement brought him out of town unexpectedly. I'm going to read his bio and then introduce Reverend Yoakum, who will sit in for him. Gary Moeller was elected an Episcopal leader of the United Methodist Church on 19 July 2012 and has been assigned to preside over the 500 Methodist congregations and 45,000 Methodists in the state of Arkansas. Bishop Moeller and his wife are parents of 2 children now living in Texas and California. Bishop Moeller's passion is leading spiritual revival that results in vital congregations and makes disciples of Jesus Christ. We are pleased that representing Bishop Moeller is the Reverend Mackie Yoakum, Executive Director of Mission and Ministry for the Arkansas Conference of the United Methodist Church, and he will share Bishop Moeller's message. Following Reverend Yoakum, we will be pleased to hear from one of our co-sponsor representatives, Priscilla Smith, from the Family Council. Priscilla is an American political strategist, humanitarian, and media personality. Priscilla has served as a communications director for well-known firms in Washington, D.C. Priscilla is a regularly featured guest on national and local news, television, and radio shows, and she hosts her own program, Engage the Nation, on local radio each Saturday. She is engaged in a wide variety of humanitarian and social causes. Priscilla enjoys the distinction of perhaps being the youngest Arkansan ever to speak at a national political convention when she addressed the Republican National Convention in 2004 at the age of 20, and we're very grateful for her to be here with us. Following Priscilla, we will be pleased to hear a videotaped message from Lieutenant Governor Tim Griffin. Now, Lieutenant Governor Griffin was invited to attend this and immediately said yes, despite the fact that he is on Army National Guard service in Maryland at this very moment. And rather than not contribute to the meeting on a topic that he feels so passionately about, he volunteered to videotape a message for us, and we'll be pleased to hear that at that point. And then we will have a musical presentation, My Country 'Tis of Thee, by Steve Oistad, accompanied by Richard Anderson. And we'll go to that point on the program. Reverend?
President Michael and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Bishop Moeller's responsibilities require him to be in Houston, Texas this morning, and so he has asked me to share with you this statement, and I do this in his behalf. The preface of the social principles of the United Methodist Church begins with these words. The United Methodist Church has a long history of concern for social justice. Its members have often taken forthright positions on controversial issues involving Christian principles. Early Methodism expressed its opposition to the slave trade, to smuggling, and to the cruel treatment of prisoners. Book of Discipline of the United Methodist Church, page 103. It is in this spirit that I am honored to lend my support to this diverse gathering of faith communities in support of religious freedom in the United States. Because the relationship between faith and government is both necessary and complex, it must continuously be addressed in order to maintain it to be appropriate and healthy. On the one hand, too much governmental favor is not good for faith communities because it threatens our integrity. On the other hand, governmental opposition to faith communities is a massive failure to protect the right of religious freedom that has been a hallmark since our nation's founding. The following words, again from the United Methodist Social Principles, addresses this. We hold governments responsible for the protection of rights of the people to free and fair elections and to the freedoms of speech, religion, assembly, communications, media, and petition for redress of grievances without fear of reprisal. Page 134 of our Book of Discipline. As I observe the current landscape, I am deeply concerned that our government is moving away from its obligation to provide for appropriate freedom for religion towards a policy of freedom from religion. This is occurring in two significant ways. First, communities of faith that play such an important role in people's lives are being pushed out of the mainstream of our common life and relegated to the margins. Second, government is taking steps to limit the expression of faith by defining what it considers properly religious. Therefore, religion is acceptable as long as it involves religious rituals, but not when it seeks to express its core values by seeking transformations of lives and communities. It is for this reason that the United Methodist Church speaks so passionately about religious persecution. Religious persecution has been common in the life of civilizations. We urge policies and practices that ensure the right of every religious group to exercise its free faith from legal, political, or economic restrictions. We condemn all overt and covert forms of religious intolerance, being especially sensitive to their expression in media stereotyping. We assert the right of all religions and their adherents to freedom from legal, economic, and social discrimination. Book of Discipline, page 117. In conclusion, I would like to offer three affirmations I believe can bind us together as we move forward from this gathering. Affirmation number one. The free and full practice of religion is a fundamental right that we must hold our government accountable to protect. Number two. The appropriate free and full practice of religion, although varying greatly from community to faith community, focuses on love of God and neighbor and therefore benefits our nation's common life. And affirmation number three. The protection of others' rights to the free and full practice of religion, even if we radically disagree with them, is necessary in order for each of us to live out our faith freely and fully. May God bless us in our efforts to live into our greatest freedom so that we may continue to be a blessing to our neighborhoods, our nation, and our world. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I am rather tall. Did you just control that from right there? That is skills. Good morning. It is an honor to be here. Thank Dr. Beheshti for the invitation. And I am representing the Arkansas Family Council, where my boss is the wonderful Mr. Jerry Cox, who has been on the front lines of fighting for religious freedom for about as long as I've been alive, so nearly 30 years. So today I'm going to talk about an issue lurking just beneath the surface of American politics, American issues. That issue is the silent war on religious liberty. President Reagan said, "Freedom is not the sole prerogative." I got a big voice. All right. Step back a little bit. President Reagan said, "Freedom is not the sole prerogative of a chosen few, but the universal right of God's children." And when he said this, he was not expressing a strictly personal belief in the nature of man as a creative being. As a child of God, he actually was reaffirming the most basic contention of the American founding, set forth in the Declaration of Independence, that we are a nation constituted in accordance with the laws of nature and of nature's God, and that we are a people endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. So let me make this explicit. The source and justification for the very existence of the United States of America is and always has been contingent upon the understanding of a man as a created being, with a creator conferring his intrinsic rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I am of the evangelical Christian persuasion. I was raised by an ordained Baptist minister, and this verse was repeated to me a lot out of Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 5. "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart," were God's words to Jeremiah. And so I'm a country girl from East Arkansas, but I've been around the block a few times. I've lived in China. I have several friends who are Buddhists and Hindus. I've been to the Far East and the Middle East. I lived in Israel for over a year. Got my degree, and my classmates were largely of the Jewish persuasion. Some of them were atheists, varying ones. I'm blessed to know Baptists, Jews, Episcopalians, Catholics, Presbyterians. I know people from all a rich tapestry of the world's faith and of American faiths. And one commonality that they all have is they look to the richness of the nature of the majesty of this world, and they wonder and inwardly seek who is the author of it all. These days we think of this diversity of belief, we think of it as being tolerated under the law and the Constitution, but that's actually wrong. This diversity of belief is the foundation of our law and Constitution. America does not sustain and create faith. Faith creates and sustains America. It's that radio. I have a radio show. I'm used to talking loud. It's also genetic. I told you my dad's a big black Baptist East Arkansas minister. I'll try to tone it down. President John Adams in 1798 wrote to Massachusetts militiamen, to remind them that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. In 1798, this was simply common sense, but in 2015, we are forced to confront a question that would have been unthinkable to President Adams. It would have been unthinkable to President Washington and even President Reagan and every other American throughout history who believed in America's founding premise. What happens when our government decides that it no longer needs a moral and religious people? Today, the American people, whether they know it or not, are mired in a silent war. It threatens the fabric of our communities, the health of our public square, and the endurance of our constitutional governance. It is a war against the propositions of the Declaration of Independence. It is a war against the spirit that motivated abolitionism. It is a war against the faith that motivated the civil rights struggle. It is a war against the soul of countless acts of charity. It is a war against the conscience that drives social change. It is a war against the heart that binds our neighborhoods together. It is a war against America's best itself and America at its best moments. It is a war, a silent war, against religious liberty. This war is waged in our courts and in the halls of political power. It is pursued with grim and relentless determination by a group of like-minded elites determined to transform this country from a land sustained by faith into a land where faith is silenced, privatized, and circumscribed. Their vision of America is not the vision of the founding. It is not even the vision of 10 years ago. It is a vision in which an individual's devotion to Almighty God is accorded as much respect as a casual hobby, and with about as many rights and protections. These elites have faced little opposition. You may have a nonprofit here, a dedicated attorney there. You may have a small business over here, a handful of principled organizations with the courage to stand up. They are the remnant who have the temerity to believe in America and its promises and to do something about it. After all, every person wants to live out his or her values. America's most fundamental promise is that we can. And when we cannot, we are told that our faiths and our consciences are a threat to good governance and the law. And that we are not, we are facing a threat to the very idea of America. Margaret Thatcher famously said, she said, Europe was created by history, America was created by philosophy. The secular elites understand this just as well as Miss Thatcher did, and they know that to take over America, they must make a war on this philosophy. See, it's a silent war, and the real undercurrent that's driving politically fractious debates in a number of areas of policy. But why is the war happening? What does it mean for our country and for the people of faith? Why does it represent such a fundamental challenge of our American identity and the exceptional history that makes our nation so great? So quickly, here's 3 storylines playing out in the states and in the highest courts, and they have overlapping effects. Number 1, you've probably heard of the Obama administration's case against Hobby Lobby. That national chain filed a suit after being told they would be fined $1.3 million per day if they didn't pay for abortions through their insurance. And then that brings us to here comes the second front. I told you there's 3. The second on the silent war. The assault on our freedom of association as people of faith to form organizations where we work alongside others who share our views. That brings us to the Hosanna Tabor case. You may have heard of this one. And it revolved around a Lutheran academy in Michigan and their right to fire a teacher. Now, that same argument that happened there is the same argument that's being advanced against the Catholic hospitals, adoption service providers, and other Catholic organizations or religious-based organizations that have deeply held worldview, and all they simply want is for their members and employees to share that worldview. The onslaught of lawsuits based in anti-discrimination law will inevitably lead to conflicts which damage our society. But those cases are only the beginning. There is a bigger threat, and that one brings me to the third front on the silent war, and that is the assault on your freedom of expression in all areas of life. Consider these many cases you hear in the news from bakers and photographers, caterers, and other wedding consultants who have religious beliefs, and those beliefs prevent them from taking part in a same-sex ceremony. The New Mexico Supreme Court, if you remember this, they ruled back in August of 2014 that one small business, Elaine Photography, had violated the Human Rights Act by declining to photograph a same-sex commitment ceremony. And in this judge's opinion, he said that these Christian photographers were being fined and that they were compelled by law to compromise the very religious beliefs that inspire their lives, because that was, in his words, the price of citizenship. This assault will only spread in the immediate future. That was just last year. We will see continued pressure brought on by anyone who refuses and refers to be penalized for their views, denied membership into professional groups, or even rejected from licenses. But that pressure is not going to stop with photographers and bakers. It's going to be brought on into your churches, into your mosques, and into your synagogues as well. This war on religious liberty and on your freedom to exercise your religion, on your freedom to associate, your freedom of expression is only going to continue, and it's going to continue because of an idea of a wrong-headed concept through which some people believe that religious freedom means you have the freedom to worship and that's it. In this misbegotten and, quite frankly, un-American conception of religious liberty, your rights begin and end in that pew. For my fellow Christians, for those of us who believe in the Great Commission, we think this is quite silly. So the opposition is suggesting that our right to worship and our right to evangelize and our right to freely practice our faith are all the same thing. But they're not. And that's not what the First Amendment clearly protects: the freedom to practice our faith and practice our conscience, even if those activities don't happen to occur inside the four walls of a church building. We have the right to practice our faith and to protect our conscience no matter where we happen to be. And that's not just for my fellow evangelical Christian believers. That's for all religions under the sun, the S-U-N, Son of God. Did y'all get that? I believe that the answer begins with the states. I believe that governors and state legislators across the country must embark on a nationwide effort on the state level to protect the rights and believers of all faiths. I do not believe that people should be punished, that businesses should be punished, that organizations should be punished for how they treat marital arrangements outside the teachings of their faith. I told you that I lived in Israel, in the Middle East, for over a year. I was there during the Pillar of Defense war that stayed on the news, that dominated the news. And I know that this is an enormous time of upheaval in the Middle East, where your beliefs can lead to your church being burned, your synagogue being burned, your mosque being destroyed, your children being kidnapped, or it could put you quite simply on the wrong side of a gun. So here in America, we should be quite grateful that the laws and principles put in place by our founders, by men like George Mason, like James Madison, like Mr. Patrick Henry, who understood the importance of religious liberty. We should be grateful that those principles have endured for so long. They are the reason why America has come so far, and it is those same principles that guide us and should guide us farther still. These principles understand that power is derived from the people and not from the government. I'm closing. Can sense somebody behind me. Calvin Coolidge, President Coolidge, said this in his own time: "We live in an age of science and abounding accumulation of material things." He said, "These did not create our declaration created them. The things of the Spirit come first. Unless we cling to that, all our material prosperity, overwhelming though it may be, or though it may appear, will turn into a barren scepter in our grasp." Now, President Coolidge was right, and I will close with this sentence: the things of the Spirit do come first. We must act now to protect them. Our religious freedom was won over the course of centuries of persecution, and blood, and we should not surrender them without a fight. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lieutenant Governor-elect Tim Griffin. Thank you for letting me be a part of this event today celebrating religious liberty. You know, one of our founding fathers, John Adams, once said, "Nothing is more dreaded than the national government meddling with religion." Even back then, in the founding of our country, religious liberty was a very important issue. In fact, many of the people who settled what we know as the United States today came to this country in search of religious liberty. Our country was founded on the idea that men and women should be able to practice their faith as they see fit, consistent with their conscience. That's why you are gathered here today, and that's why I'm here. A lot of times we think of religious liberty being under threat overseas, countries like Iraq, maybe. I served in Mosul, Iraq with the 101st Airborne Division. And in Mosul, there's been a lot of persecution of Christians. But the fight for religious liberty is not just in countries like Iraq. It's all over the world, in every country, every day. Even here in the United States, we must maintain our vigilance. We got to keep a close eye on court decisions, state courts, federal courts. We have to keep a close eye on the United States Congress, the President, as well as state legislatures, because they may take actions that we think threaten the way we practice our faith. So I just wanted to say, stay vigilant. Thank you for raising awareness. Thank you for holding this today. And thank you for emphasizing the importance of religious liberty and the ability of all Americans to worship God as they see fit. Thank you.
My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside let freedom ring. My native country, the land of the noble free, thy name I love. I love thy rocks and rills, thy woods and templed hills. My heart with rapture thrills like that above. Our Father, God, to thee, author of liberty, to thee we sing. Long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light. Protect us by thy might, great God, our King. Let mortal tongues awake, let all that breathes partake, let rot their silence breaks, the sound prolonged.
Thank you, Steve and Richard. Reverend Yoakum and Priscilla, thank you very much for those very important messages. I'd like to make a couple of acknowledgments. I'd like to express gratitude for Sister Lee Wing and Burke Sorensen, who provided, from the Arkansas Symphony Orchestra, by the way, who provided our prelude music. It was beautiful. I'd like to acknowledge and thank Sister Lewis, serving as our chorister, and Richard for his work on the piano. And if you'll take a look around, brothers and sisters, it takes an awful lot of work to host and put together a meeting such as this, and there are many hours of consecrated service that have gone into it. And for all who have labored and dedicated their time, we express our gratitude and appreciation. This has been very well worth it. Our keynote address today will be offered by a man who is well known to many of us here. He received his legal training at Brigham Young University, where he graduated with honors. His life has been devoted to academic law and to teaching. He has served as professor at no fewer than 8 law schools in the country, and has served as dean of apparently 3 of those, including his service as dean of the UALR School of Law here in the very late 1990s. Professor Rodney Smith, in 2004, was assigned and named president of Southern Virginia University in Virginia, and he served in that capacity until 2011. Professor Smith is presently professor of practice at the Sandra Day O'Connor School of Law at Arizona State University. He is the author of 25 scholarly articles. He is the author of 3 books and is in the process of writing another book as we speak, which will come out this summer. He is a widely recognized scholar on constitutional law and freedom of religion. And it is with great pleasure that we welcome as our keynote address Professor Rodney K. Smith.
Thank you, President Beheshti, and thank you for the opportunity to come home to Arkansas and to a place that is dear to me. I'm particularly grateful for what has been said. I have found it edifying, instructive. I found it uplifting. I have thought, as words were said, when 2 or 3 or 4 or more are gathered in my name, and I think that's what we see today, that the presence of that good and godly spirit will be there. I want to begin. Nothing is more important to me in my life now than being a grandfather. I'm the grandfather of 23. In fact, I'll leave tomorrow to go for the this afternoon to go for the blessing of number 23. A granddaughter was sitting on her grandfather's lap. That you might imagine this. She looks into her grandfather's eyes and begins to rub his relatively hairless head, and then looks intently into his eyes and said, "Grandpa, did Heavenly Father make you?" And grandfather said, "Sweetheart, I truly believe that Heavenly Father made me." Then she became very quizzical. She said, "Well then, do you think he made me?" And the grandfather said, "I know. I know he made you." She then changed entirely in her countenance and said, "Oh, Grandpa, don't you think he's doing a whole lot better job now than he did when he made you?" And as I have interacted with young people, I believe that to be true, but I am deeply, profoundly concerned. I'm concerned by what we learn from the Pew Research Group. I'm concerned that the rising generation is less religious, knows less about religious liberty, is less committed to those issues than any generation since the founding of this nation. And it is a part of my stewardship, and my stewardship brings me here today to try to do all that I can to get out this word, to revitalize that generation and this great nation as to the principles of religion and religious liberty. C.S. Lewis warned that, quote, "Every age has its own outlook. It is specially good at seeing certain truths and specially liable to make certain mistakes. We all, therefore, need books or instruction that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period," end quote. Well, in the remaining time I have with you, you're going to hear a very Reader's Digest condensed version of a book that I am well into the writing of. It's entitled James Madison and the Sacred Right of Religious Conscience. Again, the mistake I believe that we are making in our generation is that we are minimizing religion and marginalizing religious exercise. Religious liberty is being trumped by the will of the majority and contemporary senses of equality, and equality based primarily on group and not individual rights. I was asked in the early 1990s to go to Poland and to address the issue of equality in a group that was working on the new Polish Constitution. I gave what I thought was a beautiful discourse regarding equality and group equality, the very kind of equality that we speak so eloquently of so often in this country. But then every speaker from Poland and from East Central Europe spoke only of the rule of law and of the importance of individual liberty. And so, as we had a pause in the gatherings, and in fact, we were at this very moment in Poland in an area where it was essentially a shrine to the Catholic Church for its work in religious liberty. And my friend Leszek Garlicki, who subsequently served on the Polish Constitutional Court and the European Court of Human Rights, when I asked him, I said, why does everybody want to talk about rule of law instead of these rich theories of equality? And he put his hand on my back and patted it gently and said, Rod, you would not ask such a silly question if you'd lived for a generation without it. And so it is. So let me tell you a little bit about James Madison, a little bit about what he thought, who he was, what he taught, why he thought it was important. Then let me apply it to our day, and then close. Well, who was Madison? I believe that Madison was the greatest of the American founding generation, and there were so many. Why? He was and is commonly referred to as the father or architect of the United States Constitution. He was the father and the sponsor and principal author of the Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment. Together with Alexander Hamilton, he was the major influence in calling for the Constitutional Convention at a failed convention in Annapolis. He was the major leader in the ratification process, not just for the Constitution, but also for the Bill of Rights. He was one of two primary authors of the Federalist Papers, which were used in the ratification of the Constitution and add light to the intent of the framers of those documents, of that document. He was the author of the most extensive notes on the Constitutional Convention. He was the major proponent of limited government with clearly defined powers that liberty might be protected. He was the most effective member of the First Congress. He was a confidant of President Washington, who persuaded Washington to lend his critical support to the Constitutional Convention and to the Constitution itself. He was the Secretary of State during Jefferson's administration and was tasked with helping to negotiate and consummate the Louisiana Purchase. Additionally, because Jefferson was a bit polemical, he had to have a moderate who could bring people together so he could get things done, and that moderate was Madison. He was our fourth president of the United States who courageously led our nation through a second war with Britain. In his presidency, he recognized the right of dissenters in the midst of a war where even Washington, D.C. was under siege. He recognized their rights, as none of his predecessors had, and that caused President John Adams, who was of another party, to say of Madison that he was the greatest of our first four presidents. He was our nation's greatest advocate of a vibrant right of conscience, of which we're talking about today, rooted in the respect for human dignity and individual worth of every son and daughter of God. Madison declared that conscience is, in his words, quote, our most sacred property, end quote. He understood that it defines us in ways that nothing else can. Let me, before I get into details, share with you my favorite Madison story. Washington had worked tirelessly on a first draft of his inaugural address. He sent it to Madison. It was 70 pages long and equally tedious. And he asked if Madison might come to Mount Vernon and talk with him about that draft. This little 5'4" very quiet, soft-spoken man made his way to Mount Vernon. Of course, what he said to the president is, this has to go, and so the president said, well, then write something for me. So he largely wrote President Washington's first inaugural address. But he was also a member of the first Congress, and Congress had to respond to President Washington's address. So it was clear to everyone in Congress that Madison should be tasked with the job of responding to President Washington's inaugural address, which he did. But Washington, in defense of the presidency, said, well, of course, we must respond to Congress's response to my inaugural. So Madison wrote the response to the inaugural. Now, what does that tell us? That tells us how very respected by all Americans James Madison was. I think that should give us pause to take seriously what he considered to be the single most important right, the right of religious conscience. In fact, he said in letters to his roommate and close friend from college, as he watched Baptists, Presbyterians, and others being imprisoned for their right of conscience, he wrote that I find this most vexing. And for the rest of his life, he fought against what he found to be most vexing. He, as we have heard today already in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, set forth for the first time his view on religious liberty, and it was the essence of his position throughout his lifetime. Just a word about him and his humility. He outlived both Adams and Jefferson by 5 years. They, of course, as you know, died together at the same day. They didn't die together, they were apart. They didn't even know the other died. They were kind of worried about that. But they died the same day on July 4th. 5 years later, Madison is dying, and his doctor said, I can prolong your life so that you can die on July 4th, 4 years after. And he said, why in the world would I want to do that? And he would do nothing to diminish the greatness he saw in both of them. So he died quietly on June 28th. Well, here's what he said. Here's what he believed regarding religious liberty, the liberty of conscience. First of all, as we learned, that it is inalienable. It is a gift from God. It is between God and each person and is most sacred. And that government could only regulate it under the most limited of circumstances, but lest somebody not understand what they were, he wrote them down in the Virginia Declaration of Rights. The government could only limit religious liberty if the interests of the state were manifestly endangered, meaning that the state itself could die. could end. Why? Because then anarchy would prevail. But absent that, it was not to be regulated by government other than in one additional circumstance. And that was when the equal liberty of religious conscience of another was involved. Then they had to be balanced. He also understood, as we do in the world today, that there was a need to, and they understood very much in their world today, there needed to be some provision eliminating the establishment of a given church, that any church could gain power over the government itself. He evidenced this very effectively when he argued against the Virginia, a bill in Virginia that would have established the Christian religion as a religion of the state. And he said, essentially, in opposing that first of all, the government would start wanting to define what Christian is. Well, we in Christian faith can't even agree that one another are Christian. And they couldn't then. Of course, the Baptists were Christians, and all evangelicals weren't Christian then. That wasn't within the definition of Christianity, and government had no business defining Christianity, and certainly our Catholic brothers and sisters were outliers. He also did address Islam and Muhammad in the debates over this. He said, if we pass such a bill, they will not feel to come and join with us in this country. And he added, I personally, that was Madison, believe that Christianity is true. And I don't think it needs any false props. I don't think it needs government. I think it just needs equality. And so he fought through his life for the equality of religion. I believe he would be thrilled that we're gathered here today. His early opposition to the persecution of the Baptists and others in Virginia led to political alliances between Madison, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, Jews and other minority groups, and they repeatedly elected him. We would have no Constitution were it not for the kind of coalition that's being brought together here today. Well, next is, and this is really important, because what we hear when I talk to the young people and I start saying how important religious liberty is, their eyes glass over and they say, I can go down and worship wherever I want to, whenever I want to. What's the problem, Rod? Or what's the problem, Professor Smith? What's the big deal? Well, let me tell you what the big deal is. And Madison understood. First of all, peace. Peace. Treating all religions equally brings peace. Once again, the Pew Foundation, which is not religiously based, is independent, has found that there is a direct correlation between the degree of religious liberty and peace in any given nation. So one, it brings peace. And we need peace. My grandchildren need peace. Number two, it recognizes human worth and dignity. Conscience is the only duty-based right. The others are chosen. This one is between a man or a woman and God. It is not to be trifled with. I will confess that sometimes through inspiration, my God, whom I love and trust, has asked me to do things that by my nature I would be disinclined to do. but it is my duty, and I do this. It is not for government to trifle in that area. Human dignity. It makes, as Adams and others knew, for strong citizens. It makes for a better citizenry. May I give you two quick examples, contemporary. First, I knew two young men who happened to be Latter-day Saints. Lived in Tennessee, a less enlightened state than Arkansas. And the high school that they were in awarded both of them, because of their high rank in their class, full scholarships to college for all 4 years, this public high school. But then it learned that they were going to disrupt their education to serve missions for the God that they loved. And the scholarships were withdrawn. Now, what do you think those young men think about their high school? They would be they're hardly the high school's greatest fans. Now let me give you another example, dear to me. A young man during the Vietnam War, as a matter of conscience, declared that he could not go and take another life. He would willingly serve in a medical corps or otherwise, but he would not go and carry a weapon or take a life. So he was called before a board to determine for that young man whether his nation recognized his conscience or whether he went to prison. He shook as he received that letter. Would his nation, would it accept him? And he opened it, and his nation did. It accepted his conscience. I know of no individual more patriotic, more committed to this great country than that young man. Recognizing religious conscience leads inexorably to good citizenship and good citizens. Next, one of the problems when you get old and is you begin to tear up more often, and then it makes it hard to read your paper, and all of those things combined. So I'm struggling to, prosperity. Interestingly enough, again, the Pew Foundation, our friends, and other studies have revealed that nations that recognize religious liberty are more prosperous. And you say, how could that be? Well, religious people tend to be duty people. They tend to work. They tend to believe in things like the American dream. I was meeting with Senator Dale Bumpers once when I was the dean here. Senator Bumpers looked at me, he said, we were supposed to meet for 30 minutes, but we enjoyed the company so much, we're well after an hour. And he looks at me and he said, Rod, thus far you seem to be a pretty bright guy. But how could you have 8 children in this overpopulated world? And I said to Dale, thanks to my religion, I promise you, Senator Bumpers, that every one of my children will give more back to this country and this world than they will take. He said, well, that kind of resolves that. But that's true. That's why it makes us a more prosperous people. Madison understood that. It makes us a more charitable people. Interestingly enough, I know that all four of the other representatives of faith, I know what charitable good things they do, and their faith promotes. If you were to ask the world today for two names of those who gave more and were more committed to the poor than any others, I believe the two names that people would give would be Pope Francis and Mother Teresa. We care about the poor. For us, it's a duty. It's not a political thing to gain a vote. When someone's hungry, we hurt. And we do that, all of us together. But lest you wonder about that, let me tell you what the Prophet Muhammad had to say about this. He said, I hope this is wrong. You'll correct me. It's not. I think it was in the habit. He said, charity extinguisheth sin as water extinguisheth fire. Is that close enough? Okay. We're all, we care. We deal with poverty, the religious. Finally, courage. Well, no, not finally. I've got a seventh hard one. Number 6 is courage. Courage of conviction. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is my example there. Dr. Martin Luther King had a new pastorate. He had a young family, a baby upstairs. He had begun to work. They needed a voice. They asked him to do it. It was an act of courage. But one night, a rock came through his window, and you can find this in his biography. And on the rock it said, "You and your family are at threat or dead if you continue this work." And I'm telling you, those threats were real. And he went in and he said, I sat down at the kitchen table and I had a cup of coffee. And I resolved to go up to the bedroom where my young daughter was sleeping and tell her everything's going to be all right. Dad's going to get out of this. He's not going to do this. He went up there, took his daughter in his arms, prepared to say that, and was overwhelmed and said, "Papa's going to do this because God wants me to for you." Thank God for the courage of Dr. King. And that courage was, as he would tell you if he were here, firmly rooted in his faith. Now the 7th, I said, is disquieting, and that's judgment. We don't like to talk about judgment in the 21st century. God's all about love and nice, but there's also consequences. My favorite poet, Eliza R. Snow, penned these words: "How great, how glorious, how complete, redemption's grand design, where justice, love, and mercy meet in harmony divine." There is justice. There are consequences. There are consequences in all 6 of those areas if we fail to share this message. Now, what about the threat today? Princella's done such a great job of handling this. I don't have to, I'll go through it quickly. The book's more tedious. After 100 years, under the Warren Court, we reinvigorated the right of conscience, and they created a standard that said you can only limit religious exercise if the state had a compelling interest. Now, that's not as good as Madison's manifestly endangered, but it's pretty good. And they had to apply it in the least restrictive manner. And we went for years with that, and then Justice Scalia and 4 other justices under his leadership decided for the United States Court in Employment Division, Oregon versus Smith, that no, that's not a good test. Government should be able to do what it will in the interests of the public good. Then, in response to that, thank God for President William Jefferson Clinton. And he knows my sentiments in this, and he's actually noted them in his biography. Thank God. He said, we're going to restore religious liberty. And he got Congress together, and virtually unanimously and in a bipartisan way, something, you know what? Bipartisan's a good word. It's not 4 letters. He brought everybody together. And he said, we're going to renew it. He brought the Catholics and the Latter-day Saints. He is a great lover of the Muslim world. He brought all of them together and said, we're going to do this. And so overwhelmingly, they adopt this. That's wonderful. But then the Supreme Court, again under Scalia's guidance, so you don't have power to do that. Certainly as to the states, you might be able to do that as the federal government. So they left it intact with the federal government, but not the states. And then what's the next step? Now we move to, we'll just jump to the Affordable Care Act and Hobby Lobby. Here's this group of people. The owners provide a very liberal, much more than is required under the Act generally for its employees. But as a matter of conscience, they cannot promote abortion. So there are a couple of things that government already will supply for people that they won't. And they went after them with a viciousness in the interests, purportedly, of gender equality. They would rather have had those employees with no insurance and the owners either paying massive fines or in prison than not providing to abortifacients, which are already could be supplied elsewhere. The media came and wanted to do an interview with me, and I gave them an interview and said, this is an easy issue. Government recognizes a religious liberty, and if they choose to fund that, then go fund it. But don't violate conscience. In the last 5 years, that's the only interview I've given that never made it to the media. Well, another area, religious speech, religious advocacy is now challenged. Where did Madison get these ideas? From a good pastor and president of a faith-based university, the College of Princeton, where he went. That good pastor also was assigned the Declaration of Independence, and 14 or 16 of his students signed the Constitution. There was no question about religious leaders being able to speak out on issues any more than there should have been for Dr. King. They need to speak as a matter of conscience. We speak out. But that's in question now. We see that recently in Atlanta, when a fire chief writes a book and speaks out about his view, not as the fire chief. This book. Here's a book on fire safety. speaks out on the issue of marriage. And his view of what God would have, he felt compelled to do that. Well, immediately his employer says, you're acting in a discriminatory way. So you have two choices. Your ultimate choice is you're going to apologize. You're going to say you were wrong and apologize. He couldn't, and lost his job for speaking on an issue in a country. Now, if he had discriminated in the workplace, by golly, act against him. But he didn't. It was in the private closet of his conscience, in the words of a book that he'd written as a tribute to the God he loved. So the effort is also not only to take our exercise, but to take our voice, both of which would have vexed Madison in a significant way. We must stand together. I am so heartened, President. I think in this area, this is the most moving opportunity. If we can have more of this, how wonderful it will be. Now, may I take you to July 4th, 2000. May I take you to my father's deathbed. I am with my dad. I love you. It's my last day. I know it is. Oh, we spent that time together. It was wonderful. But as always is the case, there's a time to leave. And as I was preparing to leave, he took my hand in his emaciated hand. And I want to share with you the last two things he said to me as my father. He patted my hand and said, I want my children and my children's children to be children of faith. On his deathbed, he understood its importance. As I rose at this opening door, heart, in a voice as quiet as Madison's, he said, Ron, I love you. I bear you my witness. Now I'm going to shift as president. I bear you my witness that our Father in heaven loves all present here in the work they're doing. And if he loves us, it is time for us to make sure that our children and our children's children may have a faith and may live in a nation that permits them to exercise it. And for me, the name I personally hold so sacred, even Jesus Christ. Amen.
Professor Smith, thank you. And to everyone who has participated in this wonderful event today, thank you for being here. Thank you for teaching us. Thank you for sharing. And to all of you that have attended, thank you for coming. But that's not enough. As you leave, I ask you to contemplate this simple question. Now, therefore, what? Now, therefore, what? What are we going to do about this? If we end this meeting and we go out and have some of the hors d'oeuvres and foods that have been prepared, by the way, which are outdoors, but the tent is heated, so I invite all of you to partake. If we mingle for a few minutes with the exhibitors and make a few friends, and that's the end of it, we will have squandered a rich opportunity. This, hopefully, brothers and sisters, will drive us to action, will drive us to unite our diversity even closer for what everyone has testified is so important to us. Again, thank you for coming.